filling the air. This scene, often portrayed in countless holiday cards, movies, and stories, represents an idealized version of Christmas. It's a time for family, warmth, and joy. Yet, for many, this idyllic picture couldn't be farther from the truth. For orphans in Victorian England, Christmas was not a time of joy, but a reminder of their solitude and suffering. The contrast between this comforting holiday image and the grim reality faced by these children is stark, casting a long shadow over the festive season they were supposed to cherish. In this exploration, we'll delve into the reasons why Christmas, traditionally a time of happiness and togetherness, became a source of dread and loathing for many Victorian orphans. While society at large celebrated the season with cheer, orphans were often left to grapple with neglect, mistreatment, and exclusion. These harsh realities transformed what should have been a time of joy into a symbol of their abandonment. We will begin by understanding the circumstances in which these children lived, exploring the orphanage system, social expectations, and the general treatment of orphans during the Victorian era. From there, we'll discuss how Christmas, with all its societal emphasis on family and togetherness, highlighted the emotional wounds of these children. Finally, we'll examine how these experiences shaped their perceptions of the holiday, and how these orphans came to view Christmas not with anticipation, but with resentment. By the end, you will have a deeper understanding of the complex relationship between orphans and Christmas, shedding light on a side of the holiday that is often overlooked. The Victorian era, a period marked by rapid industrialization and societal transformation, brought with it a new and unsettling reality for the poor. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun to reshape Britain's economy, also dramatically altered the landscape of urban life. While factories, mines, and railways boomed, the working conditions for the laboring classes deteriorated. In cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham, once vibrant communities became overcrowded, polluted, and plagued with disease. The rise of industry created a stark divide between the wealthy and the poor, casting the underprivileged into a life of hardship and vulnerability. For the children of this era, many of whom were orphaned due to disease, poverty, or the untimely deaths of parents, the situation was especially dire. With the breakdown of rural communities and the influx of people into cities in search of work, families found themselves in cramped, unsanitary living conditions. The pursuit of a better life, once a hallmark of the British working class, often meant long hours in dangerous conditions for adults, leaving children to fend for themselves, with no safety nets to protect them. The streets became home to many orphan children who were abandoned by society and left to struggle for survival. This period also saw a sharp rise in social stratification, with clear distinctions between the rich and the poor. The upper classes, flush with the profits of industrial success, lived in relative comfort, shielded from the misery of the urban poor. Meanwhile, the lower classes were relegated to lives of squalor, their existence largely ignored by the privileged. For the poor, particularly orphans, Christmas offered no respite from their suffering. Rather than a time of joy and festivity, it was a stark reminder of their exclusion from the warmth and security that most families took for granted. The growing disparity between the haves and the have-nots set the stage for deep societal resentments that would color the perceptions of Christmas for generations to come. In addition to the physical and social divides, attitudes toward the poor in Victorian England were shaped by a set of prevailing moral and cultural beliefs. The poor were often viewed as morally deficient, their poverty seen as a reflection of personal failure or moral corruption. This belief in a strict social hierarchy created a moral justification for the neglect of the poor, including orphans. In the eyes of many Victorians, poverty was not simply a matter of economic circumstance. It was seen as a moral failing that the poor had to overcome. This attitude was deeply ingrained in the social fabric and would have a profound effect on the treatment of orphans during this period. The harsh treatment of the poor culminated in the passage of the New Poor Law of 1834, a piece of legislation that sought to address the growing concerns about poverty and the cost of supporting the indigent. The law was a direct response to the increasing pressure on local governments to provide for the poor, particularly as the Industrial Revolution created an ever-expanding urban underclass. The new poor law aimed to reduce public spending on relief by making conditions in workhouses so unpleasant that only the most desperate would seek help. Orphans, along with the elderly, sick, and disabled, were often sent to these workhouses, where life was grim and dehumanizing. The law introduced the principle of less eligibility, which meant that the conditions of the workhouse were intentionally kept worse than those of the lowest paid laborer. For children, this often meant harsh discipline, inadequate food, and little chance of education. The workhouses were designed to break the spirit of the poor, forcing them into submission to the system. For orphans, who had already suffered the loss of their parents and families, the workhouse became a place of punishment rather than care. The law's emphasis on self-sufficiency and its punitive nature left little room for compassion, and Christmas, a time of family and warmth for so many, became a symbol of the starkest deprivation for orphans. As the new poor law began to take hold, orphans found themselves subjected to an even harsher reality. In the eyes of Victorian society, they were no different from other poor children, merely statistics to be dealt with rather than individuals to be cared for. The system of workhouses, rather than providing a refuge, became a cold and heartless institution where orphans learned not love, but survival. The festive season, which celebrated family, unity, and goodwill, only deepened the sense of isolation and alienation for those who had no family to share it with. This growing chasm between the lives of the privileged and the reality of the poor led to a shift in the way orphans experienced Christmas. Rather than the season of joy and celebration that society cherished, Christmas became a painful reminder of their exclusion and the harshness of their existence. The emotional toll of living in such a dehumanizing system was profound, and for many Victorian orphans, the festive season became a time of longing and resentment, marking a stark contrast to the idealized images of Christmas that would later come to dominate Victorian culture. As the realities of orphan life became increasingly harsh and institutionalized, the emotional impact on children in workhouses began to take a heavy toll. It wasn't just the physical deprivation that they suffered, though that too was significant. It was the loss of hope and emotional connection. For many orphans, Christmas became a time of intense emotional strain. The festive season, designed to bring families together, only highlighted the absence of family. As the Victorian Christmas traditions began to take shape, centered around the family, the home, and the idea of charity, the gap between the privileged and the poor became even more pronounced. For orphans in workhouses, Christmas was marked not by the warmth of a family celebration, but by the cold, sterile environment of the institution. In many cases, the workhouse would try to make the day special with a meager meal or a small token gift, but these gestures felt hollow. The very idea of family, so central to Victorian Christmas celebrations, was a cruel reminder of what these children had lost. The emotional void left by the absence of parents and family was made all the more painful by the contrasting images of happiness and togetherness that dominated public life. For children who had lost their parents, the holiday season only deepened the sense of abandonment. The image of a family gathered around the tree, exchanging gifts, and celebrating together was a distant dream, a stark contrast to the isolation they faced. Instead of joy, Christmas often brought sorrow, as these children were reminded of their lack of connection to anyone who cared for them. In a society that placed such high value on family and social status, orphans were left to grapple with feelings of worthlessness and alienation. This emotional pain was compounded by the institutional nature of workhouses, where personal connection and affection were often discouraged in favor of strict discipline. The orphan children, many of whom had already suffered great losses, were expected to conform to a harsh and punitive system. For them, Christmas became a reminder of how far they had fallen from the warmth and care that society reserved for its privileged members. Rather than a time of celebration and community, it was a reminder of their own marginalization. As the century wore on, public attitudes toward orphans began to shift, but not in ways that alleviated their suffering. The growing awareness of the plight of the poor, fueled in part by the influence of reformers like Charles Dickens, brought some attention to the conditions of workhouses and orphanages. However, the reforms that did take place were slow and often insufficient. Christmas, for many of these children, continued to symbolize the deep divide between the privileged and the destitute. Dickens, whose own experiences with poverty informed much of his work, became a vocal critic of the mistreatment of the poor, especially orphans. His famous novella, A Christmas Carol, though focused on the redemption of a miserly businessman, also highlighted the suffering of children in the Victorian era. While the tale of Scrooge's transformation is one of hope and generosity, it also reflects the grim reality that orphans faced during Christmas. For them, the holiday was not a time of miracles, but a harsh reminder of their place in a society that had little room for them. The work of Dickens and other social reformers began to draw attention to the plight of orphans, but real change was slow in coming. The emotional toll of living in workhouses continued to affect these children, and Christmas remained a bitter reminder of their isolation. Though some progress was made in terms of welfare reforms, the deep-seated social attitudes that viewed the poor as morally inferior persisted, further entrenching the divide between the haves and the have-nots. As the Victorian era drew to a close, the image of Christmas as a time for family, charity, and celebration became increasingly at odds with the reality faced by many orphans. The idealized Christmas, with its focus on warmth, togetherness, and the joy of giving, was a painful contrast to the reality of orphan life in the workhouses. The emotional scars left by years of neglect, isolation, and abuse would shape how orphans viewed the holiday for years to come. For many, Christmas was not a time of joy, but a time of sorrow and resentment, an enduring symbol of the divide between the fortunate and the forsaken. By the time the Victorian Christmas had cemented its place in the cultural imagination as a season of warmth and benevolence, the orphans of Britain had already become prisoners of a system designed not to nurture, but to control. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 marked a turning point, not just in policy but in philosophy. It codified a societal stance that poverty was not merely unfortunate, but morally suspect. Its response to destitution was not compassion, but deterrence. In this climate, the workhouse became the embodiment of state charity. Not a place of relief, but a last resort. The 1834 Act had one overriding objective: to reduce the cost of poor relief. It aimed to centralize and standardize what had previously been a patchwork of local responses to poverty. Legislators feared that indiscriminate charity bred idleness, and so the solution was to make assistance so unpalatable, so humiliating, that only the most desperate would seek it. Instead of supporting the poor within their communities, as the old system had allowed, the new law forced them into workhouses. There, entire families were separated, individuality was stripped away, and every aspect of life was regulated. The law operated on the principle that poverty was a failure of personal character. To receive aid, the destitute had to surrender their freedom, dignity, and often their children. This logic extended with brutal clarity to orphans. Their status as children without guardians exempted them from blame, but not from punishment. If anything, the state viewed them as blank slates on which discipline, obedience, and industry could be inscribed. In practice, this meant that workhouses were designed less as shelters and more as mechanisms of social conditioning. For orphans, especially, the institutional environment became a formative force that would determine not only their survival, but their emotional landscape. And at no time was that emotional terrain more painfully exposed than during Christmas, when the contrast between imagined joy and institutional coldness became impossible to ignore. Inside the workhouse, the day began early and unfolded with mechanical precision. Children, like adults, were roused before dawn by the clanging of bells, their sleep often disturbed by the chill of unheated dormitories and the thin, coarse bedding they shared in long, dimly lit rooms. There was no privacy. Rows of iron-framed beds, crowded and austere, lined the sleeping quarters. The spaces smelled of sweat and soap and silence. No laughter, no murmuring, no freedom to speak out of turn. Meals were functional, not nourishing. A piece of bread, a ladle of gruel, sometimes a thin broth, rarely any meat. Food was served not to delight or comfort, but to sustain. It was consumed quickly, in silence, under the gaze of a matron or master. The intention was not merely to feed the children, but to remind them of their dependency and place. During Christmas, a slightly improved meal might be offered, a slice of meat, perhaps, or pudding. But even this gesture underscored the absence of genuine festivity. It was a concession, not a celebration. Any trace of joy was carefully measured and deliberately restrained. After breakfast, the day continued with labor. Children were assigned tasks deemed appropriate to their age and gender: breaking stones, picking oakum, or assisting in laundry and kitchen duties. Older boys might be sent out to work under contract, their wages claimed by the institution. The purpose was not skill building or education, but discipline and productivity. The work was monotonous and punishing, designed to instill habits of obedience and to rid them of what reformers saw as the indolence of poverty. There was little concern for mental development, creativity, or even physical health. Every hour was accounted for, every gesture monitored. Discipline was swift and unforgiving. Talking out of turn, slouching, failing to complete a task, all were punished. For children, punishment could include being locked in dark closets, isolation, the removal of meager privileges, or corporal punishment. These measures were not seen as cruelty, but as necessary tools to break willfulness and instill conformity. Affection was not part of the regime. Neither was emotional comfort. In a world where even a gentle word was a rarity, children learned quickly that survival depended on silence and submission. For new arrivals, especially orphans freshly cast into the system, the initiation into this environment was jarring. This period was known, with disturbing casualness, as the seasoning process. The term evokes the preparation of meat or leather, and its usage reflects the dehumanization inherent in the system. Children entering the workhouse were often disoriented, grieving, and terrified. Many had just lost parents or been removed from familiar surroundings. The seasoning process was designed to extinguish defiance and adapt them to institutional life as quickly as possible. This process began the moment they arrived. Clothing was taken and replaced with a uniform, drab, itchy, and indistinguishable from the garments worn by every other child. Personal belongings, if they had any, were confiscated. Hair was often cut short to prevent lice and remove any trace of individuality. They were bathed, examined, and then separated by age, gender, and usefulness. The separation from siblings was especially traumatic. Children clung to one another, desperate not to lose the last thread of connection they had to their past, only to be pulled apart by protocol. Many never saw their brothers or sisters again, even if they lived under the same roof. The emotional trauma of this first period was rarely acknowledged, let alone treated. Instead, it was seen as a necessary hardening. Any sign of grief, fear, or rebellion was met with punishment or isolation. The expectation was that the child would adapt quickly, fall into line, perform their duties, and accept the routines of the workhouse without complaint. For orphans, the message was clear. Your sorrow is inconvenient, your past irrelevant, and your future conditional upon your ability to conform. This brutal onboarding process left scars that would endure for life. The orphans who entered the workhouse system during this time often recalled their first weeks with a clarity that never faded. It was not just the physical discomfort, but the emotional violence, the abrupt erasure of everything that made them feel human. By the time Christmas arrived, these children had already been stripped of their identity, and the holiday, which in theory might have offered a flicker of joy, instead became a cruel echo of everything they had lost. The contrast between what Christmas promised and what it delivered only deepened their sense of displacement. In some institutions, administrators made half-hearted attempts to acknowledge the holiday. A Christmas sermon, a slightly larger meal, or a few words from a visiting clergyman were offered as proof that the system was not entirely without heart. But these gestures rarely reached the children in a meaningful way. Without the intimacy of family or the warmth of genuine affection, such efforts felt performative. A decorated tree placed at the end of a bare hall, a hymn sung without feeling, a penny's worth of sweets handed out under supervision. These were not moments of joy, but reminders of absence. Worse still, these performances were often designed not for the orphans, but for visitors, members of parish boards, local gentry, or inspectors who wished to see that the institution upheld moral duty. Charity, when it came, was staged. The children learned early that these displays were not meant to comfort them, but to satisfy the conscience of others. They were the backdrop in someone else's act of generosity, present but unseen, beneficiaries of pity rather than love. The experience of Christmas inside the workhouse therefore carried a uniquely bitter flavor. It was not merely the absence of celebration, but the presence of something far more cruel, the illusion of care without the substance of compassion. To a child who had lost everything, the holiday was not a break from suffering but a magnifying glass placed over it. Every carol, every sermon, every artificial smile from a visiting patron reinforced what they did not have: family, love, warmth, and a place to belong. This pattern repeated year after year. As orphans grew older, some were apprenticed out, others discharged. A few escaped the system through chance or resilience, but many remained trapped in a cycle of institutional care. Each Christmas another reminder of their social exile. The cumulative effect was not just disillusionment with the holiday, but a deep emotional numbness. For these children, Christmas lost all meaning. It ceased to be a time of hope and became, instead, a fixed point of emotional pain, expected, endured, and forgotten as quickly as possible. That loss, the loss of meaning in something so universally celebrated, was perhaps the cruelest effect of all. While the rest of Victorian society came to embrace Christmas as a celebration of family, compassion, and community, the orphans of the workhouse grew to see it as a carefully staged lie. And within that lie, they remained unseen. By the mid-19th century, Christmas in Britain had undergone a transformation. What had once been a relatively muted religious observance became, under the influence of Queen Victoria's court, a cultural centerpiece, a season of ritual, nostalgia, and newly forged tradition. This shift was not merely a matter of calendar and decor. It reflected a deeper social narrative, one that celebrated domesticity, sentimentality, and abundance. Across middle-class drawing rooms, the holiday became a canvas for warmth, idealism, and moral virtue. But for those watching from the margins, orphans, the poor, the institutionalized, these rituals served less as invitations and more as reminders of exclusion. The evolution of Christmas in Victorian England was heavily shaped by a confluence of influences: religious, literary, and royal. The introduction of the Christmas tree, popularized by Prince Albert and enshrined in popular illustrations, created a visual focal point for the holiday. The hearth, the home, the family united in cheer. Homes were adorned with holly, ivy, and later, elaborate paper chains and handcrafted ornaments. Cards, initially exchanged among the elite, began circulating more widely by the 1860s thanks to improvements in printing and the postal system. Carol singing, revived from earlier folk traditions, took on new life in the form of organized groups who sang for neighbors or raised money for the poor. Feasting, too, became an essential part of the Victorian Christmas. The ideal dinner, roast goose or turkey, followed by plum pudding doused in brandy, was repeated in magazines, novels, and advice manuals, forming a collective vision of what Christmas ought to look like. These meals weren't just nourishment. They were performances of prosperity and familial unity. Even the practice of gift-giving, once reserved for New Year's, gradually became a Christmas morning tradition, evolving into a key moment of emotional bonding, especially between parents and children. The rituals reinforced an ideal: a peaceful home, full of laughter, warmth, and love. But that image, so vivid and publicized, only heightened the sting for those who had no home. The spectacle of Christmas, with its growing array of symbols and customs, created a new kind of social mirror, one in which the orphans saw not only what they lacked, but what they were expected to admire from afar. For children in the workhouse, the evolving traditions of the holiday created a parallel universe just out of reach. While others sang carols beside glowing hearths, they sat in cold halls. While others unwrapped gifts chosen with love, they received government-issue socks or stiff, second-hand toys. The rituals of Christmas, instead of offering comfort, became instruments of contrast. The divide was particularly stark when it came to food. In middle-class homes, the Christmas feast was anticipated for weeks. Ingredients were purchased carefully, menus planned with enthusiasm, and the process of preparation became a family activity. By contrast, in the workhouse, food remained one of the most regulated and joyless aspects of life. Even when Christmas arrived, and the menu was nominally improved. It bore little resemblance to the merriment elsewhere. A small serving of meat or suet pudding might be offered, sometimes accompanied by a speech from a local benefactor, but the atmosphere remained sterile. There were no second helpings, no laughter, no sharing of family stories across the table. The disparity was felt even more keenly in the realm of music. Carols were among the few Christmas customs that reached into all corners of society, but even here the experience differed profoundly. Middle-class families sang together or hosted gatherings where music became a form of celebration and community. By contrast, in the workhouse, children might be required to perform for visitors, their voices raised not in joy but in obedience. These songs were rehearsed, policed, and performed under scrutiny. The same melody that stirred emotions in a warm drawing room could become a performance of compliance in the institution's assembly room. Gifts, too, told their own story. For children in private homes, Christmas morning offered an array of small luxuries. Handmade toys, sweets, books, or even new clothes. Items chosen with affection and tailored to a child's personality. In contrast, workhouse children received items chosen not for their pleasure, but for their practicality. A bar of soap, a new pair of woolen socks, perhaps a simple toy, never wrapped, never personal. There was no question of delight or surprise. These were not gifts in the emotional sense, but provisions, objects to be used, not cherished. Occasionally, public charity made appearances in the form of holiday events or donations. Local parishes or well-to-do citizens might organize a Christmas treat for the orphans. A performance, a donated meal, or a brief visit from a local dignitary. On the surface, these efforts were acts of goodwill, but their structure often revealed something more complex and performative. These charity drives were not meant to integrate the poor into the season's joy, but to reinforce the giver's virtue. The children were expected to be grateful, silent, and visibly obedient. Any sign of resistance, emotional distress, boredom, or even confusion was interpreted as ingratitude. This dynamic was perhaps clearest in the carefully choreographed Christmas visits. Patrons would arrive to tour the dormitories, inspect the children, and offer brief words of encouragement or piety. The children were scrubbed, dressed in their neatest uniforms, and sometimes even coached in how to express thanks. But these visits were not moments of warmth, they were displays. The givers came not to share in the children's world, but to affirm their distance from it. The season of charity became, paradoxically, a season of power, a time when the gap between the giver and the receiver was most visibly on display. Even in churches, where the spiritual meaning of Christmas should have offered solace, the messaging often reinforced these divisions. Sermons extolled the virtues of humility and gratitude, reminding the poor that their suffering had value in God's eyes. Orphans were told they were never truly alone, that God was their father now. But these words rang hollow against the silence of their reality. While wealthier congregants heard these messages from the comfort of their pews, returning afterward to decorated homes and abundant tables, orphans listened from drafty chapels and returned to cold, undecorated halls. This dichotomy was embedded not only in experiences but in the very language of the era. Victorian literature, even as it celebrated charity and the redemptive power of Christmas, often cast the poor as passive recipients. In stories and sermons alike, the orphan was rarely a subject with agency, but an object of benevolence. They were painted as symbols, pitiful or virtuous, meant to evoke moral response in the reader. Rarely did these narratives give space to the orphan's own voice, their own complexity. They existed to teach lessons to others, not to speak for themselves. Thus, the very rituals that made Christmas a defining moment in Victorian culture also served to entrench a vision of social order. Charity was permitted, even encouraged, but only if it preserved the boundaries between classes. True solidarity, the kind that would acknowledge the orphan's full humanity, was rare. Instead, Christmas became a spectacle of generosity that required poverty as its backdrop. The workhouse child existed not to share in the holiday, but to complete its tableau. For those growing up inside this system, the cumulative impact was not merely sadness but disorientation. They were surrounded by symbols of joy they were never meant to inhabit. They saw trees they could not decorate, songs they could not sing freely, and rituals that only emphasized their absence from the world of belonging. Each December, the performance repeated, and each year it confirmed what they had already come to believe, that the holiday did not belong to them. The loss was not only material but emotional. Christmas, which might have been a time for memory-making and bonding, became instead a theater of silence. Children learned to suppress their feelings, to watch without reacting, to endure the rituals performed around them without participating. Over time, many internalized the belief that they did not deserve more, that this painful shadow version of the holiday was the best they could expect. What should have been a time of connection became an annual rehearsal of alienation. And yet, even amid this bleakness, there were moments, brief, fragile, when the human spirit flickered through. A whispered joke between children, a hidden scrap of sweet passed hand to hand, a look shared between siblings across the divide of gendered dormitories. These moments, rare and unsanctioned, were not gifts given by the system but claimed in spite of it. They were not enough to redeem the holiday, but they were enough to resist its total erasure. In the quiet defiance of these gestures, one could glimpse what had been taken, and what, despite everything, refused to be lost. Even with the dimmed lights and the hollow rituals of institutional life, the approach of Christmas still stirred something in children who had so little else to anticipate. In workhouses, orphan asylums, and industrial schools, the month of December carried with it a faint, dangerous glimmer, the idea that perhaps this year something might be different. The season's symbols, no matter how faded by the time they reached the walls of the institution, still carried the weight of promise. It was that unspoken hope, more than anything, that left orphans most vulnerable. Their experiences of the holiday season were not solely preserved in ledgers and administrative records. Some fragments surfaced in unexpected places. Scraps of letters, memoirs written decades later, or diary entries by staff who observed more than they were meant to. In rare cases, a child's own words survived. These testimonies, brief as they may be, provide a piercing lens into how Christmas was perceived not as an escape, but as a calculated performance of care, one that often exacted a heavier toll than everyday life. One former inmate of a Yorkshire workhouse, writing in his old age, recalled the peculiar cruelty of Christmas with devastating simplicity. You could smell meat, but we were not allowed to eat it until the master said his prayer. And if we looked hungry, we were punished for greed. Another, who passed through a London orphanage in the 1860s, remembered being marched into the hall for a treat donated by local tradesmen. Mince pies distributed under the gaze of solemn trustees. They watched us as if we might steal. We were given one pie each and told to smile. These moments weren't exceptions, they were part of a pattern. Festivities were often administered with strict behavioral oversight. Any sign of overexcitement, mischief, or deviation from the expected script could lead to punishment. Singing was allowed, but not too loudly. Laughter was permitted, but only at approved intervals. Presents, when given, were to be received with silent gratitude, not joy. The orphans knew the rules. They had been taught that obedience was virtue and visibility was risk. So they adapted even when the rituals invited emotional exposure. Especially then, the cruelty lay in the dissonance between expectation and reality. Hints of festivity, an orange, a piece of cake, a visitor in a red cloak, activated hopes that had no safe place to land. Some institutions made an effort to create what they called seasonal cheer. But cheerfulness was a behavior, not a feeling. It was rehearsed, often under pressure. Children were told to sing for visitors, to recite poems about gratitude, to perform skits about the nativity. They were dressed in uniforms and paraded in front of donors, their obedience mistaken for contentment. Behind the smiling lines, hunger and exhaustion simmered. In many orphanages, the season brought not warmth, but anxiety. The pressure to perform well during holiday displays often resulted in stricter disciplinary regimes. Practice sessions for songs and performances were doubled, meals trimmed back to accommodate visitors, and punishments sharpened to ensure that no child embarrassed the institution in front of outsiders. A single mistake, a missed line, a fidget, a cough, could bring consequences. Some children were excluded from the festivities altogether for disciplinary reasons, a punishment framed as their own doing. They had chosen not to behave. They had failed to earn the day. More insidiously, institutions often framed basic needs as gifts. One orphanage's December report proudly announced that each child received a pair of new stockings and a comb, most gratefully. But the same items were required as part of the uniform and would have been issued regardless. Labeling them as gifts allowed administrators to feign generosity while masking the deprivation that made such basics feel extraordinary. This rhetorical sleight of hand recurred in many records. The warm meal that was, in fact, only warm by comparison. The brief respite from labor that replaced a Sunday rest already owed. Even where the intentions behind festive efforts were sincere, the impact was often filtered through a structure that could not accommodate real connection. A kindly matron might organize a modest celebration, a reading of a Christmas carol, or a shared bowl of custard, but even the smallest acts of kindness were overshadowed by the rigidity of the system. Children knew that the next day would bring the return of silence, chores, and hunger. The decorations came down quickly. The walls reasserted their dominance. In some ways, the brief break made the return to normal even harder. The psychology of such experiences left a deep imprint. For many orphans, Christmas became a time of confusion and emotional contradiction. They were expected to feel gratitude for things that highlighted their deprivation. They were asked to celebrate a holiday that belonged, visibly and vocally, to others. Over time, the dissonance hardened into something colder than disappointment, resignation, or worse, bitterness. The season no longer stirred hope. It simply arrived, passed through them like a shadow, and moved on. Records from some industrial schools reveal a more calculated form of manipulation. In several instances, children who misbehaved during the year were made to watch others enjoy the limited Christmas treats from a distance. This was not merely a punishment. It was theater. The message was clear. Joy was conditional. Affection, however meager, had to be earned. A loaf of bread became a measure of moral worth. A moment of song, a reward for conformity. These rituals taught children to equate love with performance and scarcity with failure. Not all reactions were passive. Some children acted out more during December, not less. One matron wrote that Christmas is the hardest month for discipline. The children are unsettled, distracted, irritable. But beneath that irritation lay a more complex emotion: grief. For children who remembered a home, however imperfect, the holidays revived sensory memories. Smells of food, the feel of blankets, the sound of someone calling their name. For those without memories, the holiday brought a different kind of ache. The ache of absence, of not knowing what they were missing but sensing keenly that they were missing something. That ache lingered long after the decorations vanished. In adult testimonies, decades removed from the institutions, Christmas remained a wound. Many former orphans described avoiding the holiday altogether in adulthood, refusing to decorate, declining invitations, staying home. Some developed rituals of their own, private and quiet, designed to reclaim the season without reenacting its trauma. One woman, raised in a Midlands workhouse, wrote in her 70s, "I light a candle each Christmas Eve and leave it by the window. For nobody. For me." Her words carried the weight of many others who chose solitude over repetition. And yet, even among those deeply scarred by the season, there was rarely hatred. What emerged instead was a sense of muted mourning, for the holiday that might have been, for the child they had been forced to become. The cruelest aspect of their experience was not the lack of gifts or the absence of family, but the pretense that those things had been offered and refused. The world had performed a holiday around them, but not with them. They had been invited to watch joy, never to feel it. That distinction, so subtle, so profound, marked them more than any one December could explain. Because what Christmas represented, more than any other season, was the promise of being seen. And for orphans in Victorian institutions, that promise was betrayed with theatrical regularity. They were dressed up, posed, praised, and forgotten in the span of a week. Their names did not appear on cards. Their laughter, if it came, echoed into silence. Their faces were remembered only in the ledger columns, not in the hearts of those who had watched them perform. It was not cruelty in the loud sense. It was the quiet erasure of the self, repeated annually. Each year, the script replayed. Hope, muted. Treats, rationed. Affection, rehearsed. And in the quiet moments between, a child's eyes scanning the hall for something, anything, that might feel real. Sometimes it was a friend's glance. Sometimes it was nothing. Sometimes it was just the sound of snow outside, reminding them that the world continued, indifferent and wide. And even in that indifference, they imagined someone waiting, not with a gift or a pie or a prayer, just a hand reaching back. What the orphans endured during Christmas did not vanish into the silence of institutional walls. Much of it survived in another form, reshaped, reimagined, and often softened through the stories that Victorian society chose to tell about them. In the public imagination, the figure of the orphan was not merely a child in need but a symbol, a moral fable in waiting. Literature, more than legislation, gave this symbol its features and its voice. Through it, the orphan emerged not as an individual, but as a metaphor, innocent yet suffering, passive yet redemptive. No writer crystallized this vision more enduringly than Charles Dickens. His 1837-39 serial Oliver Twist did not invent the orphan narrative, but it gave it a new emotional architecture, one that allowed readers to look at poverty without truly confronting its systems. Oliver, pale and pure-hearted, wanders through the brutality of workhouse life, criminal underworlds, and exploitative labor, but never loses his essential gentleness. He is a child who suffers but never hardens. His misery invites rescue, not resistance. For Victorian readers, this was more than palatable. It was comforting. It reassured them that suffering could be overcome through moral virtue, and that kindness from the privileged could redeem even the most broken child. In that sentimental framing, Dickens achieved something remarkable. He shifted the conversation about poverty from fear to feeling. Oliver Twist and later works like A Christmas Carol painted poverty in the brushstrokes of personal struggle, not structural failure. They encouraged readers to feel pity, but not necessarily to act. In Dickens's hands, Christmas became a crucible of transformation, a day on which the rich might remember the poor and, through that memory, renew their own moral selves. But in doing so, the true lived experience of children like Oliver was romanticized, trimmed to fit a narrative arc. Other writers of the period followed suit, creating orphan protagonists who suffered nobly and were eventually rescued by the intervention of moral benefactors. The literature of the mid-19th century teemed with waifs, urchins, and foundlings, each a test case for the conscience of the reader. These stories, often serialized in newspapers and magazines, reached wide audiences and helped frame the poor not as threats but as spiritual opportunities. A street boy might be dirty, unruly, even criminal, but beneath that lay the potential for transformation, if only someone cared enough to try. Yet the sentimental orphan, for all its emotional resonance, bore little resemblance to the children housed in workhouses, orphanages, and industrial schools. In official reports, those children were rarely portrayed as victims of circumstance. More often, they were described in the language of control and suspicion. Workhouse documents spoke of unruly boys, idle girls, ungrateful inmates. They were measured in terms of cost and compliance, not character. When administrators wrote about Christmas, it was often to reassure donors and inspectors that something festive had been attempted. A modest meal, a small gift, a hymn sung with appropriate discipline. That disconnect between the orphan of literature and the orphan of fact allowed Victorian society to hold two incompatible truths without discomfort. They could read stories that stirred their emotions while supporting institutions that required the suppression of those same emotions in practice. The orphan in the story reminded them to be charitable. The orphan in the ledger reminded them to be frugal. And so long as the two were kept separate, the system remained intact. Philanthropy, too, became a performance shaped by this duality. Wealthy individuals, inspired by novels or sermons, might donate turkeys or toys to local workhouses at Christmas time. Newspapers published accounts of such generosity, complete with lists of benefactors and their gifts. The orphans themselves were often named only as recipients, or more often, not at all. They became part of the scenery, an anonymous mass against which others could measure their virtue. The press described their behavior during Christmas visits as grateful, polite, obedient. Their inner lives, their private feelings about the season, went unrecorded. Meanwhile, religious publications doubled down on the idea of Christmas as a time of moral renewal through charitable acts. Sunday school tracts and temperance pamphlets featured orphan children as objects of salvation, their fate contingent on external kindness. These narratives reinforced the belief that the poor needed not just food and shelter, but correction. Kindness, it seemed, was permissible only when it produced visible moral improvement. A child who failed to improve in the prescribed way could quickly be reclassified from deserving to deviant. In contrast, a few dissenting voices emerged, not from fiction, but from social investigations and first-hand accounts. Reformers like Henry Mayhew, whose London Labour and the London Poor documented the gritty realities of street life, painted a less sentimental, more troubling picture. Mayhew's sketches of child laborers and homeless youths lacked the moral neatness of Dickens's tales. These were not orphans waiting to be saved, but survivors navigating a hostile world. And they were rarely invited into the warm glow of Christmas philanthropy, which preferred its poor to be passive and picturesque. The clash between literary representation and institutional reality also surfaced in letters written by staff members, matrons, teachers, and inspectors, who sometimes questioned the moral framework imposed on their charges. One such letter, preserved in the archives of a Liverpool industrial school, laments that the children are asked to recite verses about joy while being denied seconds at dinner. Another, from a headmistress in Birmingham, wonders whether the pageant of Christian charity we stage each December might do more harm than good, awakening desires we cannot fulfill. But these voices remained peripheral, drowned out by the dominant cultural chorus. Literature had already shaped the public lens. The orphan, as conceived by Dickens and his successors, was not meant to speak for himself. He was meant to be seen, and more importantly, to be interpreted. His silence made him pliable. Readers could project onto him whatever lesson they most needed to learn. His suffering purified them. His redemption reassured them. And in this narrative, Christmas played a pivotal role, not as a burden, but as a balm. This portrayal allowed society to externalize responsibility. If an orphan suffered, it was a tragedy. If he was saved, it was a triumph. The system that produced him remained beyond scrutiny. And for those who worked within that system, poor law guardians, institutional managers, government officials, the sentimental narrative provided convenient cover. They could point to public donations, glowing newspaper reports, and the smiling faces in staged holiday photographs as proof of their benevolence. No one needed to ask whether the smiles were rehearsed or what happened when the guests went home. Over time, these representations outlasted the institutions themselves. When workhouses began to decline in the early 20th century, replaced by other forms of child welfare, the cultural image of the Victorian orphan endured. It lingered in literature, film, and even holiday cards. The figure of the poor but grateful child, saved by seasonal charity, became a fixture of Christmas storytelling. In many ways, it still is. But the cost of that image was borne by real children. Children who, each December, were made to sit straight and sing sweetly, who received cast-off toys and called them gifts, who learned to smile on command, to express thanks they did not feel, and to measure joy not by its presence, but by how well they mimicked it. The sentimental narrative gave comfort to those who watched. It gave almost nothing to those who performed it. What remained, then, was a kind of silence, a gap between what was seen and what was lived, between the orphan in the storybook and the orphan in the ward. And in that silence, the truth of their Christmases, bleak, staged, hung with borrowed garlands, was lost to all but memory. Even after the Christmas bells fell silent and the paper crowns were swept into the hearth, something lingered in the minds of those children, something heavier than hunger or frost. For many orphans, the holiday season imprinted itself not as a fond memory, but as a recurring wound, one reopened each year by the contradiction between the promise of joy and the machinery of control that delivered it. Over time, these experiences did not simply fade into the gray of institutional life. They became embedded, forming a kind of psychological sediment, layers of memory and emotion that shaped how former inmates would come to view not only Christmas but trust, hope, and belonging itself. Within the confines of the orphanage or workhouse, even moments of relative kindness were often twisted by context. A rare sweet, a solitary toy, or a slightly warmer fire might be granted, but always with a visible hand attached. Gratitude was expected. Performative happiness was required. To the child, these moments could feel like tests, not gifts. Kindness itself became suspect, its sudden appearance evoking not relief but dread. One day a child might be handed a doll with hollow eyes and a missing foot. The next, she might be punished for playing with it too long, for forgetting her duties, or for becoming vain. In that atmosphere, children learned to associate joy with punishment, comfort with uncertainty. This instability bred more than just confusion, it bred trauma. Among psychologists today, the term trauma bonding often refers to emotional ties formed through repeated cycles of reward and abuse. Though the term did not exist in the 19th century, its effects were plainly visible in institutional life. Children who endured workhouse Christmases often learned to bond not with caregivers but with the rhythm of the system itself. They anticipated control, surveillance, and sudden shifts in mood from the adults around them. This warped their understanding of affection and taught them that affection, when offered, might be a trap. Holiday generosity became just another form of discipline, its sugar coating masking a bitter core. The long-term psychological impact of this conditioning revealed itself in subtle and enduring ways. Former orphans, interviewed decades later or reflected in letters and case reports, often displayed strikingly similar behaviors. Deep suspicion of sentimentality, discomfort during festive occasions, and a cold, almost mechanical way of describing their childhoods. One woman, raised in a northern parish workhouse, wrote in 1910, "I do not like Christmas. It is a lying time. They made us sing and smile, but inside we were afraid." Others reported feeling numb during holidays, preferring solitude over celebration. A man who had once been a charity boy in a London institution told a social worker, "The season makes me ill. It smells of boiled cabbage and forced smiles." These were not isolated reactions. In many adult orphans, the memories of Christmas did not soften with age. Instead, they hardened into a kind of internal callous, a psychological defense against the cruelty of unmet expectations. When you are taught year after year that joy is rationed and love is conditional, you do not crave the holiday. You resent it. This resentment often surfaced as sarcasm, emotional withdrawal, or outright hostility. A former orphan who later worked as a dock laborer in Bristol reportedly told his own children, "If I catch you hanging up a stocking, I'll burn it." In his world, hope was not a comfort. It was a risk. It was not simply that these individuals hated Christmas. More often, they hated what it had represented in their youth. A theatrical illusion, staged to comfort outsiders and discipline inmates. To them, Christmas was not a break from hardship, but a rehearsal in emotional containment. They had been made to smile, to give thanks, to sing hymns while their stomachs growled and their bodies ached. The cruelty of the season lay not in its absence of gifts, but in its false promise of magic. Yet within this bleak emotional architecture, some children developed coping strategies, not to find joy, but to survive the absence of it. Some learned to disassociate, retreating inward during the holidays, watching the rituals around them like plays performed on a stage. Others mocked the process quietly among themselves, using irony or shared sarcasm to reclaim a sliver of agency. These whispered exchanges, mimicking the accents of benefactors, renaming the Christmas pudding gruel cake, calling the nativity play a shame show, were acts of small rebellion. They did not change the circumstances, but they preserved the children's inner autonomy. Still others adapted by overcompensating. These children became the most obedient, the most grateful, the loudest singers and quickest smilers. They learned that approval could sometimes reduce suffering, that praise might grant them an extra scrap of food or delay the cane. But this strategy too left scars. As adults, Many of these former orphans struggled with chronic people-pleasing behaviors, low self-worth, and an inability to trust spontaneous affection. They had learned to earn love through performance, and when love was freely offered later in life, they often found themselves retreating, suspicious of its cost. Some eventually chose to reject the holiday altogether. Former orphans disproportionately reported avoiding public celebrations or refusing to decorate their homes. One 1904 letter from a former industrial school boy stated plainly, "Christmas is for fools or liars. I would rather work through it and forget the day exists." Others, paradoxically, attempted to recreate the holiday in a more authentic way, offering their own children the kind of warmth they had been denied. These individuals described the process as painful, even disorienting. "I did not know how to make joy," confessed one mother, herself a product of the Foundling Hospital. "I bought the tree and the oranges and the little gifts, but I watched them, not knowing what should come next. It felt like pretending to be a mother I had never seen." This complicated relationship with joy and ritual often extended beyond Christmas. Birthdays, weddings, even moments of professional praise could trigger unease. Emotional openness had been discouraged during their formative years, and holidays had taught them that celebration was a performance. In adulthood, many orphans, especially those who lacked post-institutional support, found themselves isolated not by circumstance alone, but by the inability to participate in communal joy. They had never learned how. In rare cases where former orphans received psychological or spiritual support, some managed to untangle these associations. Church missions and reform organizations in the early 20th century occasionally offered counseling or fellowship groups for ex-inmates. Through storytelling, community meals, and collective remembrance, a few were able to reframe their childhood holidays, not as moments of lost magic, but as survival stories. These reframings did not erase the pain, but they helped contextualize it. One man who participated in such a group wrote, "I still do not like carols, but I sing them with my children, and I let them laugh. It is not for me, it is for them." The psychological damage wrought by these early experiences was not always visible. It did not leave marks on the skin or lines in the record books, but it lived in silence, in empty hearths, in eyes that refused to meet another's during December. It echoed in the stories that went untold because no one asked, or because the answers would ruin the carefully constructed image of Victorian holiday virtue. And in that silence, many truths remained hidden. That the child's heart did not forget. That pain repeated on a calendar is not easier to bear. That resentment, when taught young, becomes a habit more enduring than hope. The quiet rupture caused by those childhood experiences did not dissipate with age. It migrated. It moved through generations, through shifting social structures and evolving institutions, shaping both individual lives and broader cultural attitudes. When the century turned and the Victorian era yielded to new sensibilities, the systems that had once defined orphan life began to unravel. But the scars they left behind did not vanish. They influenced the way society came to reimagine the very concept of care, and they haunted the way Christmas, in particular, was remembered, ritualized, and ultimately reinvented. By the late 19th century, public discomfort with the workhouse model had grown too loud to ignore. Investigative journalism, reform campaigns, and parliamentary debates brought new scrutiny to an old problem. The system that claimed to relieve the poor had, in fact, institutionalized their suffering. The 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, which once sought to deter dependence through harsh conditions, had become a symbol of moral failure. As photographs began to replace sketches and as personal testimonies found their way into pamphlets and penny papers, the public could no longer cling to the sanitized narrative of structured benevolence. They were beginning to see the children inside. This shift did not happen in a single stroke. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, change gathered momentum. The rise of progressive social thinkers, combined with the relentless work of reformers and advocacy groups, helped bring about the gradual abolition of the workhouse system. Between 1900 and 1930, the administrative structure that had once dominated poor relief in England was slowly dismantled, its buildings repurposed or demolished, its authority absorbed into emerging welfare policies. In place of the workhouse rose a new set of institutions, children's homes, cottage orphanages, and boarding schemes. These settings, though still deeply flawed by modern standards, were built on a different philosophical foundation. Where the workhouse had functioned as a warning, the newer models framed themselves around rescue, nurture, and rehabilitation. The child was no longer seen only as a burden to be contained, but increasingly as a life to be shaped. This reimagining allowed for a subtle but significant shift. The institutional child was no longer expected to perform gratitude in exchange for survival. They were, at least on paper, to be protected. That shift also reframed Christmas. In children's homes of the early 20th century, the holiday was used not as a test of obedience, but as a demonstration of care. Festive meals were emphasized, modest gifts were wrapped by staff or donated by church groups, and Christmas trees were decorated not by benefactors but by the children themselves. It was an imperfect attempt to give the illusion of family, of normalcy. Some children reported feeling genuinely moved by these efforts, describing them as the first time they'd felt seen during the season. Others viewed them with quiet cynicism, another version of the same illusion, now dressed in softer colors. Still, the difference mattered. And as the idea of childhood innocence gained cultural currency in the early 20th century, so too did the conviction that orphans deserve joy, not just discipline. Organizations like Barnardo's, the Waifs and Strays Society, and the Salvation Army seized on this evolving sentiment. They began to market the Christmas season as an opportunity for redemption, not only of the children, but of the society that had once abandoned them. Public appeals for donations used imagery of children around Christmas trees, wide-eyed and hopeful, implicitly inviting the viewer to rewrite the past through charity. "Make their Christmas bright," read one early 20th century poster, above the image of a barefoot boy holding a wrapped parcel. The appeal was no longer to deter dependence but to alleviate guilt. This shift marked the beginning of a new kind of narrative, the rescue story. In literature, in fundraising campaigns, and later in film and television, the orphan became not a cautionary figure but a symbol of the human spirit's resilience. Dickens had hinted at this in his novels, but by the mid-20th century, the image of the joyful orphan, redeemed by kindness, transformed by love, had become a cultural staple. Institutions learned to brand themselves accordingly. They began hosting Christmas pageants and printing newsletters filled with smiling children and holiday crafts. These gestures, sincere or not, helped to overwrite the older, grimmer associations between orphans and Christmas. But while the aesthetics changed, the underlying tension remained. The Christmas season had become a platform for moral storytelling, yet the stories told often simplified or erased the trauma that preceded transformation. For every child who found joy in a new home, there were others whose wounds never fully healed. And while public generosity at Christmastime surged, long-term support often lagged behind. Charity was still seasonal, and sentiment remained a poor substitute for structural care. In the post-war period, modern child welfare systems emerged in the UK and elsewhere, replacing orphanages with foster care networks and social work programs. Christmas, meanwhile, retained its emotional hold. It became not only a family holiday but a public ritual of empathy, a time when the privileged were reminded, however briefly, of the lives lived in the margins. Campaigns for children's charities filled radio airwaves and television screens. Songs were written, specials were broadcast. The orphan, once a figure of fear or pity, had been transformed into a vehicle for public virtue. Yet beneath this surface, the legacy of institutional Christmases remained. It lived on in cautionary tales, in the reluctant silences of older generations, in the vague discomfort some people feel when holiday cheer is imposed too forcefully. In recent years, as historians, social workers, and former residents of children's homes have begun to recover and re-express their experiences, a more complicated truth has re-emerged. That Christmas, while a time of giving, has also long been a time of forgetting. Forgetting what was taken, forgetting who was left behind. And this truth complicates our modern ethos. While today's Christmas is saturated with calls for inclusion, joy, and generosity, it still carries traces of its Victorian counterpart. The pressure to perform happiness, the idealization of family, the expectation that suffering can be softened with spectacle. For children who are homeless, institutionalized, or estranged from family, the holiday can still feel like a cruel contrast between fantasy and reality. And for those who survived the older systems, that contrast may still ache even decades on. But there is power in memory. The work of documenting, retelling, and reckoning with the legacy of Christmas in institutional life is more than historical. It is ethical. It challenges us to look beyond the polished surface of holiday campaigns and ask harder questions. Who is this season for? Who is expected to smile? Who gets to grieve? If there is a hopeful note to end on, it may be this: that understanding the past, even its darkest corners, can deepen our compassion in the present. That by acknowledging the orphans who once sang through gritted teeth and trembled beneath festive banners, we honor not just their pain, but their survival. And that in doing so, we resist the easy comfort of sentimentality in favor of something more enduring: empathy rooted in truth. What began as a season of promise became, for countless Victorian orphans, an annual ritual of disillusionment. They were told Christmas was a time of warmth, of generosity, of familial joy, but what they received were hollow echoes of those ideals. In the flicker of tallow candles and the forced carols sung before benefactors, they learned to mimic cheer while privately nursing a sense of absence that only deepened with age. Their loathing of Christmas was never petty or ungrateful. It was the logical reaction of children trained to perform delight under watchful eyes, punished for small longings, and rewarded only in proportion to their obedience. They hated Christmas not because it was cold or meager, but because it flaunted what they could not have: unconditional joy. Across this long arc of historical memory, we see the same bitter pattern reappear: expectation followed by disappointment, hope followed by control. The rituals meant to comfort instead distorted. The songs meant to uplift instead silenced. In understanding their resentment, we uncover not a childish ingratitude, but a profound recognition of injustice. These were children who grasped, sometimes before they had learned to read, that celebration without sincerity is cruelty in disguise. Yet there is something more valuable than mourning here, something living. The legacy of those orphans does not reside only in institutional reports or faded memoirs. It lingers in the moral questions they raise for us today. Who do we imagine when we think of holiday spirit? Whose comfort do we prioritize? And do we, in our own seasonal rituals of giving, risk reenacting the very pageantry that once masked so much suffering? Modern holiday charity often leans heavily on imagery designed to stir emotion. Children opening parcels, smiling through staged surprise, families reuniting beneath strings of lights. These gestures are often sincere, but the deeper lesson from Victorian institutions urges us to go further than feeling. It asks us to examine structure. Are we alleviating loneliness or merely decorating it? Are we addressing need or just displaying our ability to notice it? The discomfort left by those 19th century stories should not drive us to abandon tradition, but to revise it. Memory, especially memory sharpened by truth, offers us a rare opportunity, not to erase the past, but to learn how to avoid repeating it. We can choose to build a version of the holiday season that does not rely on performative joy, that does not equate gratitude with worthiness, that does not forget those for whom celebration is complicated, or painful, or altogether out of reach. To reflect honestly on these histories is to accept that Christmas has always been as much about what is absent as what is present. For Victorian orphans, it was the missing family, the withheld affection, the invisible boundary between them and the rest of the world. For many today, those absences remain. And yet, unlike the orphans of the past, we are not helpless in the face of them. We can remember, we can speak, we can change the way we celebrate. If empathy means anything, it must extend beyond sentiment into perspective. It must acknowledge not just the need for giving, but the power dynamics embedded within it. It must resist the easy narrative of redemption and instead honor the complexity of lived experience. The orphans taught us this, not with sermons or slogans, but with silence, with endurance, with the quiet defiance of memory. In telling their story, we do not rescue them, but perhaps we rescue something else: the integrity of our own celebration, the depth of our compassion, the clarity of our gaze. We look back, not to wallow in guilt, but to lift a veil that once obscured real suffering behind garlands and hymns. And once lifted, it should never fall again.